For most of your life, the national debt has been a number that scrolls past you. A background hum, a figure on a ticker in Times Square that gets bigger every year. And somehow, nothing ever seems to happen. Politicians warn about it before an election and forget about it after. Economists argue about it on cable news, while everyone at home reaches for the remote. And you've been told again and again, in 100 reassuring tones, that the United States is different. That we borrow in our own currency. That the world will always want our debt. That a country like ours doesn't run out of money the way a household does. And for decades that story held. It really did. But something about the way this conversation sounds in recent years is different. The tone has changed. The people saying it have changed. Some of the most cautious, least dramatic voices in global finance, the kind of people who spend their careers avoiding sensational language, have started using words they never used before. Ray Dalio, who built one of the largest investment firms in the world by studying exactly this kind of thing, has spent his recent work not asking whether the United States has too much debt, but asking how countries like ours eventually break under the weight of it. So the real question isn't, is the debt big? It's always been big. The question that should keep you curious for the next few minutes is this: why does it feel bigger this time? Why does a number that never seemed to matter suddenly feel like it might? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The people who understand this best aren't panicking about the size of the debt at all. They're watching something else entirely. And that something else is what this whole story is really about. Let's start with what you can see on the surface, because the surface is where most of the confusion lives. By the end of 2025, the total public debt of the United States sat at roughly 122 to 124% of the entire economy. In plain terms, the country owes more than it produces in a full year. That alone sounds alarming, but it's not actually the most important part. Debt to GDP is a headline number. It's the thing that fits on a chiron. And on its own, it doesn't tell you when a problem becomes a crisis, because plenty of countries have carried heavy debt for long stretches without anything breaking. So if the size of the debt isn't the trigger, what is? The answer is the cost of carrying it. And this is the first layer where the familiar story starts to fall apart. In 2025, the United States government paid somewhere in the neighborhood of $950 billion to just under $1 trillion, not to pay down the debt, but simply to cover the interest on it. Not to reduce what's owed, just to rent the money. And that figure crossed a line that historians of national finance pay very close attention to. Interest on the debt began to rival, and in some measures exceed, what the country spends on its own defense. Think about that for a moment. A nation is now spending as much to service its past borrowing as it spends to protect itself. That's the shift. That's why it feels bigger this time. Because for years, borrowing was nearly free. Interest rates sat near the floor, and a government could pile up obligations without feeling much pain, the way you might not feel a credit card balance when the card charges you almost nothing. But rates climbed, and when they climbed, every dollar of old debt that came due had to be refinanced at the new, higher cost. The bill didn't arrive all at once. It arrived slowly, quietly, one maturing bond at a time, and it's still arriving. This is the part people miss. The danger isn't a sudden explosion. The danger is a slow tightening. A country doesn't wake up one morning bankrupt. It wakes up one morning discovering that a larger and larger share of everything it collects in taxes goes straight to lenders before a single dollar reaches a road, a school, a hospital, or a paycheck. And once you see that, a second layer opens up beneath the first. Ray Dalio's entire framework is built around an idea he calls the big debt cycle. And the reason his work resonates right now is that it doesn't treat this moment as a random accident or a political failure. He treats it as a stage in a pattern he argues has repeated across the great powers of history, from empires that ruled the seas to the reserve currencies that ruled the world before the dollar ever did. The pattern goes something like this. A rising power grows strong. It becomes trusted. Its money becomes the money everyone else wants to hold and use. And because it's trusted, it can borrow more easily and more cheaply than anyone else on earth. That trust is a gift. But over time, the gift becomes a temptation. The country borrows more because it can. It spends more because borrowing is easy. Debt builds not during the crisis, but during the good years, when everything feels fine and no one sees a reason to stop. Then, gradually, The debt grows faster than the income that's supposed to support it. The interest starts to compound, and eventually the country reaches a point where it has to borrow just to pay the interest on what it already borrowed. Debt to pay debt. That's the stage that changes everything, because it's the stage where math stops being about politics and starts being about arithmetic. Now, here's where I want to slow down, because this is exactly the moment where a lot of finance content gets irresponsible. It reaches for the word collapse. It promises you a date. It tells you the dollar dies next Tuesday. And that's not what the serious analysis says at all. What Dalio and others actually describe is far more subtle and, honestly, far more interesting. They don't predict a single dramatic ending. They describe a set of choices a country has once it reaches this stage, and none of those choices are painless. So let's walk through them, because these choices are where the story stops being about a government and starts being about you. The first option is austerity. Spend less, tax more, tighten the belt across the entire nation. It sounds responsible, and in theory it is. But in practice, a country this deep in debt would have to cut so much and tax so much that it would choke its own economy and its own citizens. Politically, it's nearly impossible. No one gets elected promising pain. So this door exists, but almost no one walks through it willingly. The second option is to default, to simply not pay. For most countries, this is the nightmare scenario. For the United States, it's almost unthinkable, because the entire global financial system is built on the assumption that U.S. government debt is the one thing that always gets paid. Breaking that assumption would send a shockwave through every market on Earth. So this door is essentially bolted shut, which leaves the third door. And the third door is the one that history shows. Countries almost always choose, precisely because it's the one that hurts the least in the moment and the most over time. The third option is to print, to create new money, to let the central bank step in and effectively finance the government's debt by expanding the money supply. It doesn't feel like default, because everyone still gets paid in full. The bond matures, the dollars arrive, the promise is technically kept. But the dollars themselves are worth a little less than they were. And that's the trick. That's the quiet mechanism underneath the entire story. Because when a country chooses this path, it doesn't announce a crisis. There's no headline that says, "We have chosen to reduce the value of your money." Instead, prices drift upward, savings buy a little less each year. The number in your bank account stays the same, but what it can actually purchase slowly erodes. And that, more than any dramatic default, is how a heavily indebted nation quietly transfers the cost of its borrowing onto the people who hold its currency. Now stop and think about who holds that currency. You do. Your savings account holds it. Your paycheck is denominated in it. Your retirement, your pension, the cash you set aside for a house or an emergency or your kids, all of it is a claim on U.S. dollars. And this is the layer that most people never connect. Because the debt gets discussed as a government problem, a Washington problem, a someone else problem. But the mechanism that a government uses to manage an impossible debt load runs directly through the value of the money in your hands. This is why it feels bigger this time. Not because the number is large, because the number has grown large enough that the tools used to manage it start to touch ordinary life in a way they didn't before. Let me make this concrete, because abstraction is where fear either becomes useful or becomes noise. Imagine you spent 30 years doing everything right. You saved diligently. You didn't chase risky bets. You built up a cushion of cash because cash felt safe, because cash felt responsible. Now imagine that over the years that follow, the country manages its debt the way heavily indebted countries tend to, by keeping money flowing and letting the currency slowly soften. Your cushion doesn't disappear. No one takes it. The statement still shows the same balance. But the groceries cost more. The rent costs more. Healthcare costs more. And the safe choice you made turns out to have quietly lost ground every single year while you weren't watching. That's not a prediction. That's a mechanism. It's the difference between the story you were told, that debt is a distant abstraction, and the reality that the resolution of debt always eventually arrives at someone's doorstep. The only real question is whose. And here's the part that lifts this from a warning into something genuinely important to understand. This has happened before, and to people who never saw it coming, because it never looked like a catastrophe while it was happening. It looked like an ordinary decade. It looked like prices going up a little each year and everyone getting used to it. The great unwindings of debt in history rarely felt like a single event to the people living through them. They felt like a slow change in the weather. So let's go one layer deeper, because there's a piece of this that Dalio emphasizes, and that too many people skip past. The debt problem is not only a financial problem, it's a trust problem. A country can carry enormous debt for as long as the people lending to it believe they'll be repaid in money that still holds its value. The entire system runs on confidence. The United States has enjoyed the deepest well of financial confidence in human history. The dollar as the world's reserve currency, U.S. debt as the world's safe asset, the foundation everyone else builds on. That confidence is the real asset. It's worth more than any single number on any balance sheet. But confidence is also the one thing that can't be printed. It has to be earned and re-earned. And the reason serious people are paying closer attention now is not that the debt crossed some magic threshold. It's that the combination of rising debt, rising interest costs, and rising political dysfunction starts to put small cracks in that confidence. And when the world's lenders begin to wonder, even quietly, even at the margins, whether the safe asset is quite as safe as it used to be, they demand a little more to hold it. They charge a little more interest, which raises the cost of the debt, which deepens the very problem that made them nervous in the first place. That's the loop. That's the mechanism beneath the mechanism. The debt raises the interest cost. The interest cost strains the finances. The strain shakes confidence, and shaking confidence raises the interest cost again. It's self-reinforcing, and once it starts turning in earnest, it's extraordinarily hard to stop with anything other than the printing press. Now, and this matters, none of this means the United States is doomed. That's the part the fear merchants get wrong, and it's the part that makes their content worthless. The whole point of understanding a cycle is that a cycle can be navigated. Dalio's own conclusion, buried under all the grim framing, is that the solutions are actually knowable. Countries have come through these stages before. The path through usually involves some combination of the three doors: a little restraint, a little restructuring, a little restructuring, a little currency softening, spread out and managed carefully enough that the system bends without breaking. The danger is not that the ending is written. The danger is that ordinary people go through it unaware, that they hold the wrong assumptions, plan around the wrong risks, and mistake the slow erosion of their money for their own personal failure to get ahead. The greatest cost of a debt cycle is almost never paid by the informed. It's paid by the people who never understood which stage they were living in. And that's really the heart of why this story feels different now. For a long time, the honest answer to, should I worry about the debt, was, not really. Not yet, not in any way that touches your life. What's changed is that the answer has shifted from not yet to it's worth understanding, not panicking, not making desperate moves, understanding. Because the tools a nation uses to handle debt of this scale are precisely the tools that shape the value of your savings, the direction of prices, and the ground your financial plans are standing on. So what does an informed person actually take from all this? Not a prediction, not a date, not a single asset that magically saves you, because anyone who promises you that is selling something. What you take from it is a lens. You start reading the news differently. When you hear that interest costs crossed another record, you understand what stage that points to. When you hear debates about the deficit, you understand they're not abstract. They're arguments about who ultimately pays and how. When you hear the word inflation, you stop hearing it as a random misfortune and start hearing it as one of the possible outputs of a system managing an obligation it can't easily escape. You stop being a passive reader of the ticker and start being someone who understands what the ticker is actually measuring. And here's the final layer, the one worth sitting with. The reason this framework is so powerful is not that it tells you the future. It strips away the false comfort of the old story. It's always been fine, so it'll always be fine, and replaces it with something more honest and, in a strange way, more empowering. The old story asked you to trust. This framework asks you to pay attention. And in finance, attention is the one advantage available to absolutely everyone, no matter how much or how little they have. The national debt was never really a number on a ticker. It was always a slow-moving story about trust, about arithmetic, and about who carries the weight when the arithmetic finally asserts itself. For most of your life, that weight sat far away on someone else's shoulders in some distant future. What's changed is that the future got closer, the weight got heavier. And the people whose entire job is to see these things early stopped calling it a distant problem and started calling it a current one. That doesn't mean you need to be afraid. It means you get to be awake. And being awake in a moment like this is worth more than almost anything else you can hold. If this way of looking at the economy makes something click, if the story underneath the headline suddenly feels clearer than it did a few minutes ago, then this channel is built for exactly the way you think. We don't panic, and we don't do empty reassurance. We take the biggest forces shaping your money and break them down the way they actually work, one honest layer at a time. Subscribe and stay with us, because the next stage of this story is already unfolding, and understanding it early has always been the quiet advantage of the people who come out steadier on the other side. And before you go, I'd genuinely like to hear your take. When you look at the road ahead, do you think the country walks through the door of restraint or the door of the printing press? Leave your answer in the comments. The sharpest thinking in this space usually shows up down there, and I read it. Stay curious, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next breakdown.